This is the presentation on respiration for online biology at Oklahoma City Community College. I am Dennis Anderson. Here we see the overall reaction for respiration. We begin with the sugar glucose, and it's combined with oxygen, and in this process the glucose is burned, so to speak, and it breaks down to produce carbon dioxide and water. Now, energy is released when the glucose is burned. Just like when you put a log in the fireplace and you burn the log with oxygen, it gives off energy mainly in the form of heat. And this reaction does almost the same thing. Instead of burning logs, we're burning sugar, and it does give off heat, but it does give off enough energy to synthesize ATP in the body. You recall ATP is the form of energy that cells need. All of life needs energy. Every living thing has to have energy to stay alive. More specifically, the energy is needed to negate the effects of the second law of thermodynamics, which you may recall is the law that states that things tend to deteriorate over time, break down. If we were to stop making ATP in the body, we would die within just a few minutes. So we have to constantly release energy to keep our bodies from breaking down and the cells from dying. Now, the form of energy that the body uses, and all living things do, is ATP. Okay, ATP is sometimes called the energy currency of the body. And I have a little analogy here to kind of help you understand that a little better. Let's say that we have a vending machine and we want to buy something out of that vending machine. We're hungry, we want something to snack on. Well, if all we have is a $20 bill or maybe even a $100 bill, it may not work, probably won't work in the vending machine. So what we have to do is take the large $20 bill and break it down to smaller units. We break it into quarters. We can put the quarters in the machine and get what we want. Okay, so the body works in a similar fashion. So let's look at this. Instead of the vending machine, we're going to have muscles. This is muscle tissue, and muscle uses more energy than anything in the body. And instead of a $20 bill, we're going to have a molecule of sugar. So this molecule that just appeared and covers up the $20 bill is a model of sugar or glucose. Then instead of quarters, we've got ATPs. So what the body does, takes that sugar molecule, which has too much energy to be used in the muscle cell, and the body will break that glucose down and release smaller units of ATP, and then the ATP is just the right amount of energy for what the cells need to do. So the ATP is like the quarters you get out of a $20 bill. And the quarters will work in the vending machine, and ATP will work in our muscles and our brain and kidneys and every part of the body. So respiration then is the process of generating ATP, and it's been divided into 3 phases. There are a total of about 50 chemical reactions required to break sugar down all the way and make ATP. But there are 3 phases this goes through. So we're not going to learn all 50 steps by any means, but we do need to know these 3 general phases. First one is called glycolysis, which refers to the lysis or breakdown of sugars. Then we have the Krebs cycle, named after Dr. Krebs, who got the Nobel Prize for figuring this out. And then the third one is called the electron transport system. Okay, here we see the structural formula for glucose. And notice it has a carbon chain in the middle. There's 6 carbons linked together. And then coming off of those carbons are hydrogens and hydroxides in most cases. The thing that holds all these together is chemical bonds, specifically covalent bonds. And each of those bonds has energy, and if you break these bonds, it releases that energy. So when we go through metabolism, we pull the hydrogens and hydroxides off of those carbons, and we break the carbons apart. And by breaking all these covalent bonds, energy is released, and then the body uses that energy to synthesize ATP. Okay, we're going to look at the first phase of our metabolism, the process called glycolysis. And basically what happens in glycolysis is glucose is kind of broken in two, and you get 2 parts out of this initially. And each one will be identical. We'll get 2 pyruvic acids, or it's also sometimes called pyruvate. But there'll be 2 of these produced. Now, in the process of doing this, what will happen is some of those hydrogens that were on glucose are pulled off of the glucose. And they're picked up by a carrier molecule that's going to carry these to another part of the cell. And it's just abbreviated NAD. And we're not even going to worry about the name. It's a big long name for this. But NAD will combine with hydrogens and move them to another place we'll talk about in a moment. And you need some of your B vitamins to make NAD. So if you're short on some of the B vitamins, you may be tired and lack energy because you're not making enough ATP. Process also releases a little bit of ATP, not a great amount, but a little bit of ATP is made in this step. So that's glycolysis. Oh, we also can turn that pyruvic acid into alcohol if you're yeast. Yeast have the ability to convert that pyruvic acid to alcohol, and that's how they generate ATP. Now, we do it slightly differently. We don't make the alcohol. Instead, what we will make is lactic acid. So when you exercise, you will generate lactic acid in your muscles. For example, if you were to lift some weights or run or walk real fast, your muscles get tired and you have to rest them. The reason they get tired is the lactic acid causes muscle fatigue, and the body can recycle that and get rid of it, but it takes a little while. So there is a recovery time after you exercise. And the more you exercise, the better you get at recycling this lactic acid, so that as you get in good shape, you don't require as long a time to recover. The pyruvic acid has quite a bit of energy stored in it. And remember, pyruvic acid is basically 1/2 of a glucose molecule. So that is further broken down to get more energy out of it. And we convert pyruvic acid, or pyruvate, whichever name you want to call it. We convert that into acetyl, and in the process we pull out one of those carbons to make carbon dioxide. Okay, the acetyl we were talking about now enters the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is much more complex than what I have shown here, but this is just a simplified diagram so you get the overall idea. So we're not going to learn all the intermediate steps in there, but we're going to learn the basic idea. The acetyl goes through several chemical reactions, and what comes out of the Krebs cycle are hydrogens connected to NAD. So in the top right there, we've got NADH. So those hydrogens came from acetyl, which ultimately came from glucose. And then we're going to generate some ATP, not a whole bunch, but a little bit. And finally, the carbons are going to turn into carbon dioxide. So in the Krebs cycle, we start with acetyls, and our products are the three on the right: NADH, ATP, and carbon dioxide. Okay, our final step is called the electron transport system. And this is where most of our ATP is going to be made. So again, there's a whole series of complex reactions we won't bother with in this class, but we're just going to learn what we start with and what we end up with in the electron transport system. So those hydrogens that were carried by NADH from the Krebs cycle, and also the ones from glycolysis, are going to enter into the electron transport system. And at this point, the hydrogen and its electrons separate. Remember, hydrogen has one proton and one electron, and that electron is pulled off of hydrogen, and it goes through one pathway, and then the hydrogen ion that's left over goes through another pathway. And you should be aware that it is those electrons that have lots of energy. And they got the energy from the sun during photosynthesis to make the sugar. Okay, we also have to have oxygen in this system. And so what comes out of here is those electrons give up their energy. That energy forms ATP. And if you want a little more detail on how that works, you can certainly read about it in the book, but you will not be tested over all those little gory details. Okay, the oxygen is used near the end of the electron transport system because it receives those electrons after they have given up their energy, and also receives the hydrogens, and when you combine hydrogen and oxygen you get water, and so water is the other thing that comes out of the electron transport system. So two main products, ATP and water, and most of our ATP is made in this step. So now you know why you have to breathe oxygen. Oxygen is required in the electron transport system because it collects hydrogen ions and electrons to make water and get those out of there so new hydrogens and electrons can go through and make new ATP. Let's compare respiration with photosynthesis that we learned about earlier. The two reactions are exactly opposite each other. Now on the top we have respiration, and as you now know, the glucose and oxygen react to release energy, and then byproducts that are left over are carbon dioxide and water. Now at the bottom of the slide we see the reaction for photosynthesis, and here the carbon dioxide and water are joined together to make glucose. To do that though, to hook all those molecules together, you have to input energy to join them together. And of course, plants get this energy from the sun. And then kind of a byproduct of this is oxygen. So we have to have glucose and oxygen to make energy for us, and plants have to have carbon dioxide and water so they can make glucose for themselves. So you should be very familiar with these two reactions for respiration and photosynthesis. Okay, here we see a drawing of a typical cell, and this is going to illustrate where these processes of respiration take place. Okay, at the bottom of the screen, or near the middle I guess, it shows that glycolysis is taking place inside of the cell in the cytoplasm. So that's where glycolysis takes place, in the cytoplasm. Then the Krebs cycle and electron transport system take place inside of mitochondria. And the mitochondria are those little organelles in the cell where this takes place. These little mitochondria are very similar to those primitive cells called prokaryotic cells, like we have in bacteria. They're about the same size as a prokaryotic cell. They have their own DNA, and they make their own proteins and reproduce by themselves. So they're almost like a separate organism living inside of our cells. In fact, what happened a long, long time ago is a cell from a one-celled organism engulfed a bacterium we see in the upper left corner. And this bacterium had the ability to go through the electron transport system and the Krebs cycle, and so it gave that cell a lot of energy, and so the cell just kept these little bacteria, and they became what we now know as our mitochondria. So if we didn't have the mitochondria, all we could do is make energy with glycolysis, which wouldn't be enough to keep us alive with our big bodies and high metabolic demands. So to summarize, we have glycolysis, which can produce ATP, and it does it without oxygen. Just the last two stages require oxygen. So we sometimes say that it is anaerobic. Aerobic means using oxygen. Like aerobic exercises make you breathe a lot. Anaerobic is the opposite, without oxygen. Okay, the process of glycolysis only makes 2 ATP molecules, so it's not very productive. Pyruvic acid, which of course is made in glycolysis, enters the Krebs cycle as acetals if oxygen is present. If there is no oxygen, then those pyruvic acids will ferment into alcohol if you're yeast, or in us it ferments into lactic acid. And finally, the electron transport system produces the most ATP molecules, and it is aerobic, so it's got to have oxygen or it won't work. This concludes the presentation on respiration.